Okay, welcome to the 31st episode of An Evolving Man podcast. Really delighted to have Rod Boothroyd back again. And today we're going to be exploring the aspect of the lover archetype. So Rod is a counsellor, psychotherapist, a certified Healing the Shadow practitioner, and the author of the book Warrior, Magician, Lover, King, a guide to the male archetypes updated for the 21st century. He works with men, women, and mixed groups to heal the wounds of childhood with Marianne Hill, and also trains people in the art of working with the shadow and healing emotional wounds. So welcome, Rod.
Thanks very much, Piers. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to have you back. So let's jump straight into the questions.
Yeah.
What is the lover archetype?
Yeah, well, it's the part of a person that's concerned with feeling, emotion, intimacy. You could sum it up fundamentally as the part of us that's fundamentally motivated by connection with others. And that manifests from birth in the bonding of mother and child, where if all goes well, mother is the center of the universe. Apologies, the other way round. The child is the center of the universe and mother rotates around her so that all the needs of that infant are met. And in that blissful state of union with mother, where the child doesn't know it's a separate part of the bigger whole, mother and child unit, comes that fundamental expression of the lover archetype, the desire to merge, to be with one in the most intimate connection possible, to be with another in the most intimate connection possible. So what does that manifest as in later life? Obviously, relationships of any kind that serve to provide that sense of connection, that sense of, I am not alone in the world, because if I were alone in the world, who knows what might happen. Certainly for a child, being alone and not connected represents a threat to survival. And that may not be true later on in life, but all of us know to some degree how aloneness is not the best place to be in the world. The world seems brighter when we're connected to other people. So people say when we talk about the emotion of the lover, that it's love, but I would see it more as love as more of a state of being. It's the state of being that you feel when you're connected to another person.
Thank you, Rod. And as you speak that, it brings me this realization over the last few years with lockdowns and separation. It almost feels like the lover has had the greatest impact.
Oh, I think that's probably true. And the tragedy, Piers, is that people don't recognize it because it's such a felt thing in the body. You know, we can speak our feelings. We know when we feel angry, for instance, but it's a little bit different when you're not connected. It's like almost like you don't know quite what's not there because it's intangible. It's like, what is missing from my life? I've got food, I've got a roof over my head, if that's true, of course. Yeah, but I still feel kind of something is different. Absence of connection, maybe. Yeah, the aloneness, the separation of families and friends and the inability to meet up and just connect with people and just kind of feel their presence. I agree with you totally. I think it's had a devastating effect on people's well-being.
Yeah. I'm sure I could go off on lots of tangents, but I will not today. So I'd love you to expand a little bit about what makes a balanced and mature lover.
Absolutely. Well, I think fundamentally it's the security of relationship at birth and in infancy, providing a sense of security. And what stems from that is a certainty that the world is a safe place, the world will meet my needs, and also I'm lovable, people will want to love me, and I can love other people. So that's the balanced, mature archetype. And how is it expressed? It's expressed in healthy relationships that are neither needy nor desperate nor distant. It's expressed in an acceptance of relationships for what they are and an acceptance of the other. It's expressed as a healthy sense of, I can be with somebody and I can be on my own and I will still be content because I love myself. But as we just mentioned, there might well be a point where that gives way to, actually, I'd really rather be in connection with others, at least some of the time. So, you know, that sense of loving self, loving others, being able to connect to self, being able to connect to others, not being needy, not being desperate, and actually the opposite, not being stoic. I don't need anybody. So it's all of those things.
Thank you. Thank you. So almost this sense of, you know, I can love other people, or I'm lovable.
Mm-hmm.
I presume then if we move into the shadows,
yes,
if we're not receiving, either we don't feel we're lovable, or we feel like we can't love other people.
That's exactly right.
Then go into shadows.
Well, sadly, you know, we could all imagine a world where children are treated with respect and loved from birth. And sadly, we know that's not true for many children. Alice Miller, who wrote about child abuse and how ingrained in Western society it was, rather ironically, she was the first person to actually consciously expose that. Mm-hmm. She herself, it turns out, was not an ideal mother by any stretch of the imagination. Mm-hmm. As her son recounted in his book about his life with her, he waited till she died, but I mean, irony upon irony, the theoretician and the practice. But anyway, Alice Miller said she thought that only about 25% of children had, sorry, I think if I've got that wrong, I think what she said was 50% of children had an adequate upbringing, 25% had a less than adequate upbringing, and 5% had an abusive upbringing. Something, the statistics are not exact there, obviously, that doesn't add up to 100%. But for the sake of illustration, what she was saying was that a large proportion of children in Western society do not have good childhood, do not have secure attachment, are not loved, or maybe not even wanted. You know, something that I found out years ago, which I think is indicative of that fact that so many children are wanted, is that in America, 50% of pregnancies are not planned. 50%. Now, of course, it may be that a lot of those children are loved, but, you know, it could be that a lot of those children are not loved. Mm-hmm. So a child isn't cared for, isn't loved, isn't secure. Its response to that is to feel that it's not loved. So its loving energy is somehow wrong. Its energy, its desire to connect is somehow wrong. And what it does with that is to put it into shadow, which results in disconnection, isolation, fear, I would imagine, and a sense of not being loved for the sake of one's own existence, not being loved just because one happens to be here on the planet. Now, you say, well, okay, but we know there are lots of reasons why children may have to put their lover energy into shadow, and they're all quite understandable. We live in a society where parents are tired, stressed, holding down more than one job or no job at all. We're living in a society, I believe, it's a personal opinion, that's lost sight of the importance of human connection. And that manifests in families as separation of parents and children from that intimate, loving bond. Now, the fundamental question there for me is, when a child finds itself in that situation and it puts its lover energy into shadow because it's less painful to do that than to extend to another and not be met, what happens to the child? And the answer is, it depends on the child's individual psychology. But what will happen is that the child will form a belief about herself or himself. And those beliefs could be things like, I'm not worthy, I'm not wanted, I'm not loved, I'm not lovable, nobody loves me, nobody will ever love me, there's something wrong with me, because if there weren't something wrong with me, people would love me. I have to work really hard to get love, I will never be loved, and so on and so on and so on. Leaving the child in a place with a desire to connect, which is biological, and a belief system that somehow stops them doing it. Is that clear so far? Got any questions?
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense.
Right. So the child has a belief system which affects her entire way of being in the world, and has shoved all that lover energy into the shadow. In other words, repressed it. It's too painful to feel the desire for connection, which is unmet. So what happens to that energy when it's pushed out of sight into the shadow bag, as Robert Bly so memorably said? Answer Robert Bly's words, it de-evolves towards barbarism. It's a harsh way of putting it, but what he meant was it goes in the bag and it doesn't stay the same. It looks like love when it goes in, but when it comes out again, it looks very different. Inflated or deflated, just words we use to describe what can happen to energy in shadow. Inflated, neediness, desperation, clinginess, an overwhelming desire and drive to be united with a loved one, but actually beyond that, to be connected. That kind of person who sadly is so over everything, so all over you and so clingy and so needy that there's a kind of reaction and recoil. Oh, get off me. Just because they are so desperate for connection. And the people who seek relationship endlessly and somehow it never works for them, that desperation driving them. Of course, the opposite is the deflation, which would be, you know what, I don't need anybody, I'm fine just the way I am. Forget it. What do I want with a relationship? Because even the pain of being alone is less than feeling the pain of the original wound. And of course, much of this is unconscious. So nobody, I suspect, very few people anyway in that situation will rationalize it. So why am I so needy in relationship? I don't think people think like that. I might be wrong, I don't know. Why don't I need anybody in my life? It's all right, it's just the way it is. But it's a tragedy. It denies them a fundamental part of their humanity.
Thank you. Yeah, I can definitely relate. And as I've looked at the archetypes myself over the years, I've always seen that I've always been more of the deflation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the coward or the weakling. And in the lover, I've forgotten the deflation. And I see that's partly to do with the boarding school thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
At a young age, you don't have your mother or your father there. You have to just, if you're needy, you cry, you're laughed at. So it's like one has to withdraw inside. I don't need anyone. I'm fine. Even though inside we're like, oh, I just want to be hugged. I just want to be loved.
Oh God, the pain of it is just incredible.
Yeah. So I really kind of resonate with that inflation. So, one of my next questions, and I guess is about the specific shadows. And in particular, you mentioned about the inflation. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about addictions or that addiction.
Yeah, definitely. Side. Great question. Thank you. It's really fascinating. Well, that de-evolving into barbarism is a quite complicated process, because what you end up with can look very, very different to anything that you might think of as a lover wound. So the way I see it is something like this. The pain of that unfulfilled need for connection, particularly if it occurs from birth, or God, pre-birth, can you imagine it? When a child isn't wanted and grows in a soup of its mother's hormones, which are all about stress. I mean, how is that going to affect a developing brain in a baby? So, yes, that's the worst case, but you just mentioned another, Piers, what I've worked with quite a few people over the years who were sent to boarding school at 4, 5, and 6 years of age, particularly in foreign countries, in British colonies, South Africa and India. I find it unimaginable what that must do. I guess it's less serious than separation at birth, but it's still pretty awful. So the pain of it can't be felt. It's too intense. And so it's repressed. And it, in Robert Bly's phrase, de-evolves into something else. Addictions, drinking, drugs. I mean, specifically alcohol, although people can be addicted to coffee and tea. Sex, porn. Really what's going on there, I think, is the transformation of a desire, of the pain of an unmet desire for connection. And it's transformed into a desire for anything that looks like it will soothe the unconscious pain of a lack of connection or a loss of connection. So you think of drink, for instance, you can see how that could work because, drugs too, there's a momentary hit. There's a momentary hit of something that could be seen as soothing. And that reward is intense for the wounded part that's holding the pain of the lost lover connection. And you say, well, okay, gambling, that's a bit harder, isn't it, to explain on that basis? And yet, in a way, I don't think it is, because what gamblers I've worked with tell me is there's a moment of excitement, of feeling powerful and like I can do anything. The moment before the bet goes down and it's lost, as in the end, of course, it inevitably will be, there's a feeling of power and supremacy and perhaps even control. But of course, as we know, the pain that follows the drinking, the drugs, the addictions, the porn, the sex, or the guilt that follows, then needs soothing. So what happens? The inner child that's driving all of this can't discriminate in an adult way between a good strategy and a bad strategy. So off the person goes to get the bottle, the drugs, the drink, put the bet on, or whatever it is. And it's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy and a loss of the human spirit. I was just struck there by the sadness of it all and just feeling something of that for the people who are in that situation.
Yeah. Thank you. Whether to go there now or maybe we come back to it later, but I get a sense as you're saying this, it's like, is it that we've lost that connection with ourselves? So actually what we're seeking in the drugs, in the porn, is actually we want to love ourselves. Yes, there needs to be that connection with others, but is at the core of this that...
It's a great question. I think it's both, actually, Piers, connection with self and connection with others. I would assume, I'm not a child psychologist, but I'd assume that a child learns to love herself or himself by being loved by mother and father or somebody, a significant attachment figure. So my guess would be that if there isn't a significant attachment or the attachment is lost, then there's a loss of love for others and a loss of love for self as well. I would guess. I'm not absolutely sure about that. But sorry, you've got a question, go ahead.
Yeah, what comes to me is like, maybe I experienced that a bit, that somehow when I, had no longer a connection with my parents going off to boarding school, I felt, well, there was obviously something wrong with me.
Something wrong with you, yeah.
But it's like, and I can't remember who I was reading, which psychologist was saying this, might have been Joy Chavarin, saying that often as a child, if our parents are arguing, the blame always goes back to us. What have I done?
Yeah, absolutely.
Was it something I said earlier, or I messed up at my class? We don't know, and we don't externalize that.
Well, it was again Alice Miller who had that insight, I believe, that it's too frightening for a child to believe that the relationship of attachment figures is going to break up, which is what a child would naturally assume if mother and father are at each other's throats all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is less painful to assume this is because of something I have done than it is to assume this is because the parents are dysfunctional. Not that a child would use that language, of course.
Yeah.
They take the blame onto themselves in an effort to see the relationship between their parent or between them and their caregiver as ideal. So there's an element of idealization going on. And of course, you've got to put the negative energy somewhere if you're idealizing something. So put it on yourself.
Okay.
Yeah, so children do generally blame themselves. In my experience, 90 or 95% of children, probably about 90%, will blame themselves for what went wrong in childhood and continue to see it that way in adulthood. And about 10% have something in them that stops that process happening, and they rebel right from the start. But the majority of people will always blame themselves in childhood for what goes wrong.
Amazing. I didn't know that. That's a huge amount.
That's based on, I must say, by the way, that's based on my experience of working with people who come for therapy. So it might not be exactly a random sample.
Yeah. So coming back to the question, I mean, the emotional wounds, you've spoken about that. You've also spoken about some of the self-beliefs which have come from that emotional wounds. What would you say is the key emotion then for the lover?
Yeah, it's a great question, isn't it? Excuse me. Well, people talk about love, of course, and I say, well, I think that's more a state of being that encompasses happiness and joy and things that are not exactly emotions and not exactly thoughts, like, for example, a sense of self-pride and satisfaction. Those are partly cognitive and partly emotion. So I find it quite hard to say, well, we all think we know what love is, but then what is love? Is it an emotion or a feeling or a combination of feeling and beliefs? The other side of the equation is very straightforward. It's grief, as in the grief that people feel when a relationship ends that meant something important to them, or when somebody dies who was important to them. And the grief represents the distress and that loss and that, well, emotional wound is not too strong a term. And I'd argue that actually it's always a fairly young part of somebody who's feeling grief in response to loss, at least the level of grief that produces crying and wailing and that level of expression after, say, a parent dies. What the part of the person that's actually crying is probably quite young, I think, generally speaking.
So with the grief, I mean, I've heard other people speak about this on, I think you might have shared this maybe in the first podcast we did, that almost grief is a gateway into joy, but it's almost like we've got to grieve, because I feel, and I can't remember if it was you who said this idea that grief and joy are the different sides of the same hand, but when we will not feel our grief, we therefore can't really feel our joy.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It's so true. If people don't express grief or touch into it and express it, they will not be able to touch into their joy, at least not fully. It's hard for most of us, I think, in the Western world to imagine that you could live in a state of joy consistently. And yet there's plenty of evidence from different worlds that actually is possible. And I see the reason for that as being the unexpressed grief of all the losses that we experience in this particular kind of society that we're living in. Boarding schools, death of grandparents, death of pets, all these things that children are not allowed somehow to, or culturally there's a taboo against expressing. A lot of people of my generation, and perhaps even younger than me, tell me that they were not allowed to go to their parents' or grandparents' funerals, and I quote, because it will upset you. I mean, really, when you think about it, that's a society that's really put a taboo on the public expression of grief. And the consequence for the individual who's not allowed to grieve is profound. They carry it with them like a leaden weight through the rest of their lives. So much so that when people start grief work, they say things like, "This is too painful, I can't do it." But what I've come to understand is what they're actually saying is that I feel pain so intense, and I believe if I cry, it will make it worse. Whereas actually it's the crying that relieves the pain of unexpressed grief. And people say things like, I don't want to grieve because if I start, I'll never stop crying, and I feel like I'm drowning in my own tears. It's a metaphor people use a lot, like an ocean of grief. I'll be drowned in my own grief. Well, the truth is, the more you cry, the lower the ocean gets. And then one day you find your head's out of the water, and believe it or not, one day you find it's around your knees and you can wade quite happily through it. And then I have seen that's the point at which joy enters people's life. Yeah. The more grieving they do, the more joy they feel.
Yeah. And I'm sure we've spoken about this in one of the other podcasts. I think Pete Walker talks about this, that says when we grieve, our inner critic also diminishes. That actually, we need to grieve. We need to have the space for tears in order for that inner critic, which I guess, in the archetypal world, but perhaps is the magician, that
I don't think so. Yeah.
That then that energy diminishes, and then joy can come up because you don't have this inner tyrant going, "You're an idiot, you're a dick."
Absolutely. Well, what crossed my mind when you said that is, if you're not grieving, where's the energy of that grief going to go?
Yeah,
it's going to go somewhere, isn't it? Inner critic. Perfect. What a place for it to go.
Yeah, and it's almost like, it's almost like we've somehow labeled grief as bad.
Yeah, very much so.
And I think it was, forget his name, but a Guatemalan shaman, hearing him speak, saying that in his village they had two ladies who were considered the grievers, or the tear. I can't remember the holders of tears or something. And you used to buy them a gift, or you get them a gift, and then if you had lost someone, you'd go and sit by the river with them, and they would go, start crying, and you would cry with them.
Beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah.
And Francis Weller speaks a lot about that. I forget the name of his book, but I'll find out afterwards, and perhaps you could put it on the recommendations, because he's really the champion of leading the grief movement in the West.
Right.
Yeah, fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And you see, the other thing about this aspect of grief is that it keeps people small. It keeps them from expressing their full potential. They can't step fully into their king or queen or leader, whatever you want to call that part of personality, until they've expressed the grief and shed some of the weight that's holding them in that inner child place. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I certainly found that when I went through, I spent a few years every day crying, and afterwards it was like the shackles, or that I could see it was almost like the exoskeleton over my heart started to loosen, and having more access, that the grief kept me quite small in my the deflated lover, and as the grief, it was like, the heart I could feel again.
Absolutely, totally. Absolutely. It just reminds me, before we move on, of the exquisite sensitivity of that inner child. I mean, it's hard to imagine how sensitive and delicate that part is. If you work on the idea that each archetype is made up of different ages, which it clearly is, then I would assume the lover archetype inside each one of us contains all of the wounds that we experienced in that post-birth pre-verbal place, and we're still carrying them. And that requires, as we'll come on to in a minute, the expression of some way of expressing the grief that isn't verbal, because it's a pre-verbal energy. Yeah. I sometimes think it's a bit of a design flaw in the human being, really, that we are so sensitive and have this incredible need for connection. Anyway, there we are, we do, and it's generally, I think, not met. And perhaps the thought that just flashed across my mind is maybe one representation of that suppression of lover energy is the product that we're seeing in the Ukraine right now. Because if you felt connected to fellow human beings in any meaningful way, how could you do the kind of things that are happening over there? Interesting question. I'm sure there's a very good answer to it. Like when the warrior's around, the lover will hide, but I still think it's an indication of the degree to which our society has resulted in a suppression of lover energy.
Yeah. Going back to what you were just saying about us as humans being overly sensitive, I remember having a discussion with my teacher, my Buddhist teacher, and he says, "Oh, you're too sensitive," or something like, "You're overly sensitive, Piers." And I mentioned this to my therapist, and she said, "Oh, what nonsense!" She was like a senior Jungian analyst, and she was like, "What nonsense? You're not overly sensitive. It's a gift, Piers." I'm like, oh yeah. And I kind of come back to the quote from The Work, that film in Folsom Prison, where one of the facilitators say a man cries with his shoulders back and his head up, and almost like that, the lover archetype, when we're in that grief, he also has the warrior there. And I sometimes have had that I've cried and someone says, or tries to stop me, and it's like, no, leave me to just feel this. It's okay. This will flow.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much so.
Yeah.
It's more about their discomfort, isn't it? Or their desire to soothe, perhaps, than concern. What they need to do is just sit and be with and attune, not necessarily attune, but certainly feel empathy with. And some people, the best therapists, would attune to the emotion that somebody else is feeling and leave them there to express the grief, but in company, which is how it's meant to be, of course. That's our social construct as human beings. We're meant to be doing these things together.
Yeah.
As we hit on at the start of this interview, not alone, isolated from our support networks.
And that makes it's interesting. I was just reading a book by Dawson Church, who's on the podcast in a few weeks, who's wrote "The Genie is the Gene," the genie in your genes. He's a scientist, and he's saying kind of 10 key principles about energy psychology and working with others. He says it's love, it's the heart. It's like, does your doctor love you? Does your therapist love you? And saying actually just having a connection, having someone who really cares for you, that's almost the biggest healing over anything they say or do. So
well, it really is. I mean, there's endless research, time and time again, has proved the same thing, which is that regardless of the nature of the healing therapy, the key factor in people's, I was going to say recovery, but that's an interesting word in itself. The key element in people's, I can't think of a better word, let's call it recovery, is the relationship they have with the therapist. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It's being demonstrated in study after study. And, as I say that, I think back to the early days of Freudian analysis, where the patient, even there's a one up, one down thing, isn't there? Therapist, patient. Just lie on the couch and I'll sit behind your head and never say a word. And then you can free associate to your heart's content, and it's a blank screen. Zilch relationship. Poof. Well, great. So thank God we've moved on from that particular style of therapy. Although there are people who still practice it.
Right. That always used to be the archetypal kind of image from movies. Someone going to the therapist. You know, I think even the Avengers movie recently had Bruce Banner, you know, sat there on a couch. So.
I saw a cartoon once with that client on the couch and the therapist behind the notepad and pen out of sight. And all he'd written on the notepad was just plain nuts. Okay. Which speaks for the absence of relationship, really. But it's a telling point, isn't it? You know, we're smiling about it and laughing about it, but that's the truth. The truth is we are social animals and we need that to stay emotionally healthy. That's the truth of it.
So coming back to the question I had was, and you kind of brought this up, coming back to what you said about the Ukraine. There seems to be a conflict almost. If we look at those 4 archetypes, the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover, is that the lover seems to be about having no boundaries. It's like, right, to just do anything. And the warriors are out, boom, boundaries.
Yeah.
And then, you know, how can we integrate the lover without it spiraling into no boundaries, right? Addictions. Hey, I'm just gonna.
Yeah, quite. Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking it. The answer is in the sovereign archetype, not the warrior. I think the truth is, whether we're designed that way or not is an open question that I'm not going to try and answer. But warriors in battle need to adopt a certain frame of mind, which may or may not include compassion for their enemy, let's call it that. So I think the separation of those two is probably quite, those two are probably quite distinct and separated. And yet, you know, even as I say that, Piers, I'm thinking of the defensiveness of women around the family and the home, that actually, why are women such good warriors when it comes to an assault on the family and the home is because they're defending what basically is lover territory, whereas men, regrettably, in war, will often set out to destroy lover territory. It's a very sad aspect of human nature. So I wouldn't look to the warrior for the boundarying of the lover. I'd look somewhere else, and I'd look to the king or queen. So the way I see it is that the king or queen, there's energy flowing from that archetype down to the lover, which, as you so rightly say, has this desire to be unbounded and expressive and self-indulgent and God knows what. It's the energy of the king or queen that needs to contain the inner child. Like a good parent would be a king or queen to their child. You know, that's not appropriate. You can't do that. I love you, but I'm not buying you that £1,000 toy for Christmas kind of thing. And then hold the child in its distress so that the child can learn to hold him or herself in the distress they feel by incorporating the energy of their sovereign, which, by the way, is more or less what happens in therapy, or at least I think ought to happen in good therapy, that the client borrows the sovereign of the therapist until they've implanted enough sovereign energy in themselves by the experience of being held that they can contain their inner child. That makes sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Just checking.
Yeah.
But the other side of the dynamic is that the energy needs to flow from the inner child upwards into the sovereign.
Yeah.
And that provides the sovereign with joy and fun and laughter and happiness, which is very necessary, because without it, the sovereign who's running some kind of kingdom or queendom is going to get worn out, exhausted, be unable to function, or worse, is going to become a tyrant. Because I think tyrant kings and queens, amongst other reasons, have no inner child to give them joy and happiness and pleasure. Excuse me. So that loop needs to be complete in both directions to provide a balanced internal system. Just to reiterate, without the energy from the sovereign, the inner child's bounds are just boundaryless. Yeah, you know, And that's the motivation of the inner child. Think of orgasm. That's, people report feeling completely merged with something at the moment of orgasm. That's the inner child's drive to feel that, because it represents the mother-child bond of boundarylessness. And then there's that joy and happiness, and you know how children are, they're exhausting. Well, they are for me. My granddaughter's exhausting, but a delight to be around. And I feel inspired and uplifted, but my God, I'm exhausted because she has boundless energy. So that's the energy that flows upwards to whoever's king in her kingdom or queendom. So yeah, complete circle there.
Thank you. So I guess, would you be able to answer that question? Because the people I often work with really struggle to have any lover energy. And they're warrior, they're magician, not that much king, but very little lover, because, you know, boarding school, trauma, it's like squash that lover. So how do we bring that in? Because it's in conflict with the other archetypes, because the warrior is right, go out, do, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I think the answer is you get to it through the body, because it's so much about the lover archetype, so much about an embodied state of being. You know, and people say, well, where do you feel things? And you stop to reflect on that question. The answer is mostly in the body. I think when people are angry, although they can sort of identify their behavior as angry, if they stop to look at the feeling, it's in, usually I think, in their belly. Grief, sort of behind the eyes, fairly obviously. Love, somewhere in the heart. You know, whatever metaphor each of us has for those feelings, it's in the body. So it follows, if you want to connect with your lover, do something with your body. So that can range from massage. Shiatsu is particularly good, people tell me. All kinds of body work. And that would include grief work, of course. Francis Weller's grief circles. Tantra is great for people who are stuck in, particularly, you know, stuck in a magician place. It's kind of head upwards way of being in the world. Tantra, opening the doors to relinquishing the mind and engaging the body. I've been on a few Tantra workshops myself, and I can testify the power of that sense of, yeah, just moving into a different space. And magician can just go off and have a cup of coffee for a few hours. Keeping watch, though, of course, all the time. There's an organization called Celebration of Being, which offers workshops. You have, I think, got it on the list of resources. It offers workshops for both men and women, which I have experienced their workshop for men, and people tell me their workshop, and I actually have experienced the workshop for women too. I staffed that once. The point being that the women who hold space in those workshops are in a state of pretty much as lover as you can be. So for men who are not accustomed to move into lover, it's a beautiful experience, which almost inevitably chips away at the resistance, you know, just because you're infused with lover energy of the women holding the space. And it's incredible power. I should say those are not sexual workshops in any way. They just, when I say lover, I mean the archetypal energy of feminine grace and love, which does its magic on men in that circle. And then the converse is where men help to hold the space for women. And the same miraculous sort of thing happens where men remarkably move into their lover and the women respond by moving into their lover. They're fantastic workshops. I've got a lot of respect for Celebration of Being and Debbie and Gina, who are the leaders of those workshops. Just worth mentioning in passing, perhaps, that for men who feel they are too lover and perhaps needy and can't get into relationship, those have gambling problems perhaps, then Mankind Project's Warrior Weekend is a great place to go. Or Michael Mays' SIP, Change is Possible project. He's doing great work as well. So yeah, works both ways. Too much lover, too much warrior. You can go to a workshop that helps you experience one that you're short of.
Yeah, Michael Maisie does those 4 archetypes. Actually, I'm going to one of his workshops I mentioned before this weekend, which is more leadership, but then he's doing the lover, the warrior, the magician, and then the final one is the king. You can only do the king one if you've been to those other 3. And then also Craig White.
Great, good call. Yeah,
he does that king warrior magician lover retreats, and they're amazing. I haven't been to one yet, but
I've heard great things about Craig's workshops. Yeah, fantastic. But as I say that, and as you respond with the idea of Craig's workshops, what pops into my head is the fear that people may feel when they hear about workshops where, oh my God, you have to show emotion, and even worse, you might even whisper it, have to cry.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there is, of course, the king's intention required, that actually the king or queen needs to be strong enough to say, I recognize there's grief and pain, and it could be uncomfortable. And actually, for the good of my kingdom, for the good of my queendom, for the good of the world that I'm somehow in charge of, I am going to do this. I'm going to make a decision with king's intention, queen's intention, and regardless of what happens as a result of that decision, I'm going to go to the workshop, no matter how much fear I feel, no matter how many boxes of celebrations or Mars bars I have to eat on the train on the way there to soothe my inner child. I am still going to that workshop. It's a kind of massive piece of therapy in its own right.
Yeah, I've had kind of fear come up myself about going off this weekend, and yet I know it's like that short-term pain for long-term gain. Definitely. I know that I feel some fear, and once I'm there within an hour, it's like, oh, I'm so glad I've come. This is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm aware we've got just about 10, 15 minutes left. So one of it seemed to have gone quickly. I thought after we'd answered the first 6 or 7 questions, I'm like, oh, how are we going to fill an hour? But
well, it's all, exactly.
The lover, spontaneous. So I would love you to speak a little bit. Maybe we bring this in with the father, the king archetype. But the question was really about the need of a strong father in puberty to help the adolescent break away from the mother, so that he can experience himself as fully masculine.
Absolutely. It's a great question again, Piers, and thanks for asking it. When I was staffing the Mankind Project weekends, the men who were there right at the start, which I think was in the late 90s, I'm not absolutely sure about that, mid to late 90s, told me that most of the men who arrived on the Mankind Project weekends were angry. And when I was staffing, and as I went through the staffings that I did over a number of years, 16 years or so, I think, something like that, what I saw was men arriving who were in a state of fear. And I thought, why is that? If it were true they were angry 20, 30 years ago, why are they mostly fearful now? I don't have an answer to the question, but of course it's fun to speculate. And I rather suspect it's the product of the lack of father-son contact that we see. I don't know what percentage we see in today's society. I don't know what percentage of marriages or relationships end in divorce, but I do know one startling thing, which is that once a couple have split up, 50% of fathers never see their children again in America. And in this country, I believe it's about 33%. Subject to somebody telling me I'm wrong, but let's say it's extraordinarily high. So wouldn't that, wouldn't that lead to a situation where men with no father present in their lives would not know how to be a man? Well, you might argue with that, isn't it in the genes? But I don't think it is. I think it's different for men and women. Women are born of women, they're born of the same gender, they grow up with the same gender, they understand what it means to be a woman. They go through rites of passage that mothers will explain to them, like menstruation and childbirth. I think their growth into womanhood is different than a boy's growth into manhood. And I think it specifically requires a male role model who can embody masculine qualities for a boy to learn how to be a man. And my wife, who worked in Africa for many years, would talk of how the boys and the men were just together all the time. There was some mysterious process, almost like osmosis, where masculinity just seeped into the boys. And kind of watching and being with the men. They just knew what it meant to be a man in that society. And of course, Bly, I think, was of the same opinion. He spoke of how industrialization, separation of men from the home and family had led to inadequate masculine role models for the boys growing up. And then some people would argue that the loss of rites of passage around adolescence had led to a failure of masculinity. By the way, that's an argument I'm not convinced by. I'm open to it. But if you look at how savage those adolescent rites of passage were, there seems to be a kind of rough correlation with how warlike the society was, which kind of makes sense in a way anyway. But I'm just wondering if those rites of passage were more about producing warriors who didn't feel pain by giving boys such traumatic, painful experiences in their rite of passage that they were just cut off from feeling, so they could go out and fight without fear. You know, like some of the American Indians reputedly, today is a good day to die. I mean, I think to say that, if that's true, you'd have to be pretty cut off from any feeling at all. But I don't know the truth of it. What I do know, however, is that journeyman in the UK who've done the rite of passage weekend for young boys demonstrate pretty clearly that something changes when those boys go through that. Obviously not danger. It's not dangerous. It's a celebration of their move from boyhood to manhood. And it involves older men modeling masculinity, amongst other things. It's like there's a switch flicked just because they go through the process, that instead of identifying as a boy, they can either start to, or perhaps, who knows, even more completely identify as a man because they've gone through a rite of passage. So on a personal level, leaving aside the question of rites of passage, it seems pretty clear to me that a man has to be there for a boy to know what masculinity is, good or bad. It doesn't mean to say he's going to accept his father's model. Some men reject it, even in their adolescence, because it's brutal and violent. They turn the other way. But somehow their father's presence does provide them with a model of masculinity. There's just one other point I was going to make about that idea. The boys idealize their fathers as the first step of incorporating masculinity into themselves. And I think there's got to be a point, perhaps much, much sooner than adolescence, where a boy looks at his parents and he realizes, I'm not going to be like mother, I'm going to be like father. And something about that seems very important to me. It's like the moment where sexual identity, gender identity perhaps begins to form. Makes me wonder what happens if a father isn't present at that point. And what if a father isn't present to celebrate his boy's puberty and movement into manhood? And what if father isn't present, or some other role model who's adequate? It doesn't have to be dad. What if some other consistent male role model isn't there to explain sex, masturbation, porn, relationships, violence, aggression, model how to control aggression? Actually, we know the answer to that question. What happens when boys form gangs, they become brutalized, they act out the violence that the gangs enact on the streets, and so on and so on. And the whole of society suffers because of it. Is that an answer to the question, Piers, or is there something else arising?
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, there's lots of trains of thought as you speak about that. And I'll be with my lover and just let them flow out again.
Yeah, great.
but yeah, I think that for me is, and I see that the fathers, it's almost like when we don't have that, you know, as Robert Moore, Douglas Gillette talk about, when we are focusing our love on our mothers, but then we get to puberty, and at that point we need to almost transfer that love to the father, And if
Yes.
they're not there, you know, and I see that they call this helicoptering parents in the US a lot, that there's no real separation. So we don't learn what is it to be a man.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
I don't see how you possibly can. I don't see how a boy possibly can learn how to be a man without the role models that would teach him those things.
Yeah. And I read something recently, or I've heard someone speak, is your children do not learn by what you tell them to do. They learn by what you model.
Yes, absolutely. They do. They learn by watching. That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
So I know a young man who was born of mixed race, drug dealing father. Mother took him to the countryside to live and to get him away from the example of his father. And he was interested in rugby and started playing at the age of 8 and eventually ended up in one of the professional squads. And his role models were rugby coaches. And he quite explicitly recognizes that they taught him qualities like control of aggression, purpose, direction, warrior energy, and what to do with it, how to control it, leadership, i.e. king energy. Of course, then the question arises, where does boy learn lover energy? Well, hopefully, I guess the answer is he learns it much earlier on in life, and he has a secure attachment to mum after he's born. I would guess that's the answer to that question. And then he brings that energy back into relationships in his later life. But yes, the warrior and the king, I think, have to be in large part modeled by men.
Thank you. So I guess, the last question really is, how do we cultivate the lover? You've spoken a little bit about that, but are there specific steps? Because that's one of the things I love about your book. For those people who haven't read it, please do. You've updated the from when I first bought my copy, and I love about it is you've got these steps, which step 1, this is what you need to do. So what would you say for us who feel like I have no lover?
Yeah,
nothing there.
Yes, great question. Let's recap. Find a grief circle. Find a body, an embodied therapy like shiatsu, massage. Go on a workshop that's focused on the lover. I've mentioned celebration of being. There's a colleague of mine, Ed Rook, who runs a lover workshop for men, which I've actually experienced as co-facilitator with him. I would highly recommend it. So if anybody wants to know about that, they can just get in touch with me and I'll forward on the information to them. And also there are more subtle things that I don't know very much about, but I keep hearing the names, things like heart math, which is a school of practice, I think, which involves consciously accessing the heart and feeling through it. But like all the archetypal energies, Piers, I think what it comes down to in the end is that somebody has the commitment to find a way of practicing and then to make that a habit. One massage, one session of shiatsu will not a lover make. Whereas a regular practice of some kind will really make your lover energy grow. That could be as simple as engaging in 3 sessions of 15 minutes of eye gazing with your partner a week. Or it could be as complicated as going on a tantra workshop every month. But it's all about making the effort to find something embodied and to make it a habit. And even, as I say that, even the thought of just closing my eyes, in fact, why don't we do it right now in conclusion? So I just close my eyes and just move from my head, where we've been, ironically, for so much of this talk about the lover, into my body. And I do that just by switching my attention and just suddenly beginning to be aware of my body that perhaps for the last 50 minutes I hadn't really been paying much attention to. And just starting at the top of my head and moving downwards. Immediately I can notice there's something behind my eyes. I suspect that's grief. In fact, I'm sure it is. I don't know what it's about. Probably about Ukraine, since that popped into my mind. Then at the back of my neck, this real tension. Feels like that's guarding against something. And my arms seem reasonably relaxed and warm and comfortable. My heart too, but if I go down to my belly, there's a tight knot of anxiety there. And what's that about? If I just stop and I open to receive an answer, not thinking about it or trying to work it out. It's about the fact that I feel I've got a lot to do in the rest of the day and not enough time to do it. And I just breathe into that. And it kind of softens a bit. And so I'm hoping as we do this, that each of your listeners is just doing the same thing with their eyes closed, just scanning from the top of their head, right down through the body, slowly and gently, not thinking, just inviting what is to speak out, to make itself known, and perhaps even for thoughts to arise spontaneously about what this means. And then having checked in, maybe choosing one of the areas where there's feeling in the body, breathing in, and on the out breath, slow, long out breath, just imagining that whatever it is that you're feeling in your body in that place is softening or changing. Softening or changing or being somehow integrated. Taking another breath in. And then on the out breath, again, the same thing. Just feeling the change that can come through simple attention to the body. And perhaps making a mental note to try that for a little bit longer after we've finished the podcast. And for the moment, just coming back to the screen so that we can conclude for today.
Thank you, Rod. Yeah, I can feel some tension in my shoulders. There'd be a bit of grief here, throat and face. So thank you. Beautiful.
Good. Well, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, Piers, and I think we're probably about wrapped up for today, aren't we?
I think so. Yeah. So final bit is, I always ask this at the end of our thing. Our podcast is how to connect to your work. So links are below. Anything you'd like to say about that today, Rod, about reaching out or?
Yes, I'm always open for people to reach out. And in particular, as I mentioned, if they want to connect with Ed's Lover Workshop, I can send them information about how to do that. So perhaps you could make a note of that on the information.
Yeah. I'll put that in. I'll see if I can. I'll get his email, his website address, and put that in.
And then also, I'm just going to send you. I've already sent you a few books that I think are particularly good around this whole area, but I've got a couple more suggestions that popped up during the course of our talk. So I'll send those as well.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your work, Rod. Really, it's so powerful. And sometimes people who are involved in my world of boarding school or trauma, and they're like, well, what's archetypes got to do with it? And it's like everything. That's everything. How we are meant to be as men and women.
Exactly.
We've not been given this roadmap. Here's the roadmap, guys. we're just boys in adults' bodies or girls in adults' bodies. This is the roadmap. So thank you.
Pleasure. See you next time.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.